Hello and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. Today, as promised, we are taking a break from general 20th century history, and instead I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. So, some of you have been donating to the podcast and some of you have been writing to me, and I'm very grateful for everybody who both donates and writes. Thank you so much. It really means a lot to me that we're kind of forming a community. It's a small community, but it's really, really nice to hear from you guys, especially when, it's to trade ideas or ask questions or ask for book recommendations. But in this case, actually, I'm doing a book review about a book that was recommended to me by one of you guys. And the money that I used to buy the book in question was bought with the donations from the podcast. So again, thanks to everyone. Especially the person who recommended this book. You know who you are. So the book I'm going to be reviewing today is called The Firemaker by author and screenwriter Peter May. It's part of a series of books about China. Peter May is not Chinese, if you couldn't guess by the name. So I'm just going to launch into the book review, and that will be today's episode. So first I'm just going to talk about the author a little bit. Peter May is a Scottish scriptwriter who I believe primarily worked on writing, editing and producing television scripts, but he also has some success as a crime fiction writer and has a few different series featuring different main characters in different countries, so for example in France as well. I personally don't know any of the shows that he's worked on because he stopped doing screenwriting in 96 and I was born in 91, so it's a little bit before my time. But some examples are The Standard and Squadron, which are both late 70s, early 80s British TV shows. His first ever book was actually rejected by major publishers in the UK, which is a very familiar story for most writers, and it was actually published in France, in French, to critical acclaim, and then his later books were all published by Quercus, which is an independent publisher, which was then acquired by Hodder, which is now acquired by Hachette, because there were basically only 3 publishing houses in existence. So like I said, he has several series of these sort of crime thriller books, and one of them is called the China Thrillers, and it features 6 books and 1 novella, originally published between 1999 and 2004, and they focus on these 2 main characters, Detective Li Yan, who is Chinese, and the American pathologist Dr. Margaret Campbell, and their crime fighting and the relationship. If anything, it seems that the crimes and the mysteries are more like a backdrop to explore the relationship between the two, but we'll get into that a bit later. The first book in the series is called Firemaker, and that is the book that we'll be talking about today. So as Peter May is Scottish, most of his writing is set in Scotland, or based on Scottish people who live in France, which is where he lives now. So the real question is, how did he end up writing an entire series of crime thrillers set in Beijing and steeped in Chinese and also a fair bit of American culture? So May's website has a really long blog post about how he went about researching and writing the books for the China thriller series. And I don't know if this is a bad thing to say, but I actually found the blog post a little bit more interesting than the actual book. But I think that's just because I'm a big non-fiction fan, obviously, because you guys are listening to my podcast, which is about Chinese history. But the blog post is actually genuinely a really fascinating read, and I will link it in the show description so that you can read it through yourself. But to summarise it without ruining it, he talks about how he first visited mainland China quite by accident, during a trip to Hong Kong in the early 1980s, how he became obsessed with the country and began reading everything about it that he could, and how he became determined to be the first person to write a crime thriller set in Beijing in English. He linked up with an American police advisor that had worked in the country and managed to secure unprecedented access to the Chinese police department, which would probably be unthinkable today. But at the time, in the 90s, research interest in China was only really just picking up, and so heavy supervision or straight up banning of foreigners from certain information wasn't really normalised yet. During his several visits, he met people who would become the inspiration for many of the characters in the book, and he learned everything he needed to know about policing, propaganda, and public security politics in China. If you look at the comments underneath that post, it's full of his fans not only praising the series, but also apparently really desperate for a 7th book. Clearly some people got addicted, and I guess that's kind of understandable given the type of novel and type of series that it is. But in his responses, May actually says that it was his former publisher that pulled the plug on the series, and unfortunately he doesn't really feel like returning to China to try and update himself on everything going on. He doesn't really feel like that would be worthwhile, or like the characters would still be the same. So it seems like the time has passed and the series is finished, despite what May and his fans would have wanted. So in total, there are just the 6 books and the 1 novella. Interestingly, it seems that his work is a hit in China as well. The Chinese Crime Writers Association have made him an honorary member, and he is the only Westerner to ever have received this honour, which is pretty cool. Okay, so let's move on to the actual book itself. Just a couple of notes. I'm not gonna give this book a rating, like, out of 5, because, first of all, this isn't Goodreads, and second of all, it's a genre fiction book. So everybody's taste is really different when it comes to this sort of thing. I personally really like crime fiction novels and novellas. You know, like when I need to relax or I'm on holiday or something like that, I like to flip through those sorts of books. But some people may not like it simply because it's that genre. So I'm not going to give it like 1 or a 5. I'm just going to try and give as much detail about the book without spoiling it, so that you can make up your own mind as to whether or not it sounds appealing. But there are obviously some subjective opinions in here as well, based on my own knowledge of China and just personal preferences, things like writing style. But again, I will try not to influence you and just try and be as objective as possible. So let's start with the story. Like most books in the crime thriller genre, the story is pretty straightforward. To describe it without giving too much away, basically you have the Chinese detective who is trying to solve a series of murders that seem interlinked due to a clue that's found at each of the scenes and the way that the murders are committed. And he ends up enlisting the help of a visiting American pathologist who has come over from Chicago. She's trying to escape some bad things that have happened in her past, and it shows in her personality and whatever. And, she knows nothing about China. He knows some stuff about America, and, they're both hot-headed and they don't really hit it off right away, but through circumstances they end up having to work together. And as is the case sometimes with this sort of book, a larger conspiracy is unveiled through their working together, and the second half of the book has not necessarily a twist. It's not something that I would say you wouldn't see coming, but it's quite a big reveal. I have no problems with the story. I thought it was fun, interesting, it kept me engaged, and at no point was I bored with what was going on. There are no glaring plot holes that I could spot, but I'm also not a plot hole kind of person. I don't read books or watch films to pick them apart, but I think even if you're the type of person who likes a neat and tidy narrative, this book is fine. It also takes place over a really short span of time, so there's not really any space for things to go really wild. If I had to compare it to a book that I've read before, I would probably compare it to the book Fatherland by Robert Harris, partially because it's got that historical bent to it. It's also the crime genre fiction with a larger conspiracy background. Fatherland is a really good book. It's about a crime that's committed in Nazi Germany had the Nazis won the Second World War. So if you like that sort of thing and you end up reading this book, The Firemaker, then Fatherland might be another one that you want to check out as well. Okay, so let's talk about the writing. Again, this is a personal taste sort of thing. There's lots of metaphor. The book is very descriptive. It's probably the reason why it ended up being so long. The book is like 500 pages long, and I don't think that has anything to do with how convoluted the story is. I think it could have easily been 250 to 300 pages if there had just been less sort of descriptive. I think it's quite obvious that Peter May has worked in television before because everything is very detailed. there's a lot of minute detail that could have been summarized in a single phrase, like, the office was very busy, as opposed to describing what literally every single person is doing, almost as if it's like a stage direction. But having said that, the book is also very readable, and the dialogue also flows pretty well. It's a little bit sharp in some places, but I'll get into sort of more about that in a little bit. Despite how long-winded it can be, the writing does get to the point a lot and fast, to the extent where you're like, okay, the two main characters went from hating each other to having a passionate attraction for each other very quickly. But again, this kind of makes sense in the context of this genre, and with the pacing of the book, it's kind of like expected that you get that whirlwind attraction. It's kind of predictable and quite believable, to be honest. Also, just as an aside, there is a lot of reference to the female lead's body, especially her breasts. I don't know if I only noticed this because I read a lot of the book in one go and it seemed like there were a lot of references, but it is something that stood out to me. I'm not sure if the writer was trying to highlight that she was more scantily clad, or perhaps her body shape is different from the typical Chinese woman, but I thought it was quite amusing, the amount that it came up. Again, this is probably part of his device to point out and really drive home the fact that there is sexual attraction between these two characters and build up that will they, won't they element of the plot a bit faster and more believably. Like I mentioned earlier, the book takes place within a very short span of time. There's a lot of events that happen very quickly, and around half of the book takes place over the course of around 24 hours. And also the American pathologist has literally just arrived in China. So some of it can feel a little bit, not rushed, but I definitely found myself forgetting that Margaret had only just arrived in the country. It felt more like a week had gone by the way people were talking to each other and the way events were developing. Like, I'm sure that police investigations do not move this quickly normally, but this is actually something that the book tries to address. I don't know how well you would say that it did this. It was enough for me, to be honest, but it's genre fiction, so it has to move a pace, and if we're honest, most fiction is a series of coincidences or contrivances anyway. So that's the kind of style that you can expect when you're reading it. The pacing is very fast, the relationships change quickly, but that's the pressure cooker nature of the setting. Something that stood out to me a lot was the references to Chinese culture and history. There are lots of short and interesting asides about China's past and present development, and a lot of it is quite organic. For example, they'll be driving past a building and, Margaret being new to the country, she's kind of like the reader surrogate. She'll be like, what's that building? And then the person in the car will explain to her. And it makes sense in that sort of context. There's also scenes that are deliberately in there so that you can learn more about Chinese culture. For example, the lead detective is quite a conservative, straightforward guy who's trying to get on with his career, but his uncle is a bit more traditional and sends a feng shui man to his office to try and rearrange the office, change the decoration in order to improve his qi. And so you have things that are like sort of slipped in there as comedic timing for character development, but at the same time they serve as a way to introduce you to certain aspects of Chinese culture. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. However, I found that in some places it felt too much, but I feel like that's just because I know so much already about Chinese culture and history that I often felt like I was being beaten over the head with information. Whereas if you're someone who doesn't know much about China, or you're like the main American character who doesn't know anything at all about Chinese culture, then it's probably more helpful and actually provides much needed context when you're reading the book. I could have easily read the story without the references to the Cultural Revolution and just from people's ages, known exactly why they behaved, why they did, why they said certain things. I've also been to Beijing several times, so I know the layout, and I've lived in China, so I'm aware of things like banquet culture and the importance of face. But I know that a lot of Westerners would be completely clueless about this stuff, and this book would serve as kind of like an introduction for them to Chinese culture. So actually, if I was to evaluate it objectively, I would say that the references to culture and history are very valuable. It's just, for me, it slowed the pace down. So something that really stood out to me, again, was the fact that there are a lot of stereotypes in this book. By that I mean that the Americans are very American in the way that the rest of the world thinks of Americans. They're loud, they're obnoxious, they're ignorant, they're emotional, they don't put up with innuendo or unnecessarily formal conventions. And the Chinese are very Chinese. They care a lot about face, they imply a lot of meaning when they're talking about awkward subjects, but then they can be very direct in their speech. This sort of shorthand way of writing characters is very typical of genre fiction, and especially the crime genre, from what I know. So because the book takes place over a short period of time as well, and the action has to get started straight away, if you're going to wrap it all up in one book, then the characters can't be too unique or complex. They have to be readily understandable and formulaic enough so that the reader doesn't really get confused when they make certain choices. It's like everything that happens, you can see immediately falls within the realms of that character. I used to read a lot of Italian police drama thriller books, and I swear the main police officer in every book was always the same character. He always had a string of girlfriends, commitment issues, possibly a drinking problem, and was smoking a cigar in pretty much every scene. So I actually went out of my way to do a little bit of research as to whether or not stereotyping was really an important convention of this sort of crime thriller genre. And I came across a very helpful article called Critical Investigations, Convention and Ideology in Detective Fiction by William Stowe. And he says this: "The continuing appeal of the detective novel has frequently been explained by the genre's conservatism. Politically, morally, and epistemologically, detective fiction tends to affirm rather than to question, to take social structures, moral codes, and ways of knowing as given rather than subjecting them to thorough, principled criticism. In conventional detective stories, crime is usually seen as a symptom of personal evil rather than social injustice, and the detective is depicted as an ideal incarnation of competitive individualism. The truth in these novels may be elusive, but it's ultimately knowable and always worth knowing. The hero's goal, simply put, is to right wrongs by uncovering facts." So I think that short statement really does apply to this book quite well. If you've read a lot of crime or thriller fiction, you're going to recognise a lot of the tropes that go on. The lead detective is the typical brilliant ace of the department who, for either a personal or political reason, has been held back or is troubled in some way. He's also more cultured than other people in some way. This is something that I always notice when reading these sorts of books. Like, the detective is always like a chess genius or something, or a wine expert, and they're always morally upstanding. They're never just like a regular dude. Their flaws are more like defective personality quirks that make them seem fixable, or that can be overlooked and that never really seem to impact their work or the wider story. I've also noticed that in these sorts of stories, including in this book to an extent, the justice system is seen to be working perfectly, except for a few bad apples who are more like a tumour on an otherwise perfect establishment, rather than a symptom of the establishment or institution's culture and structure. The bad guys are always just the bad guys, while the detectives and police officers may be jerks, but most of them are there to do a good job. And in Chinese crime fiction, just like in Chinese TV dramas, the police are always the good guys. Interestingly, there's a heated conversation between the two leads that compares China and America, and I would say that Chinese society comes off very well and in many respects gets off very lightly, whereas America certainly gets the sharp end of the stick. All Chinese people in the book come across very knowledgeable and progressive, whereas the Americans are always either ignorant, drunk, or annoying, and the burden is always on them to accept the Chinese way of things, which is fair to an extent because they are in China, but it's interesting how China is presented as this really progressive, up-and-coming, helpful and cultured place where everyone has an interesting past. The book also neatly skips over fairly tragic and consequential political events while still wanting to mention them to give cultural background to the story. every character has something to say about the Cultural Revolution, how before that they were famous, or they were like a Kant scholar or something, but there's no real acknowledgement that the CCP at the time of writing the book is the same CCP that oversaw the Cultural Revolution. So there's a lot of compressing and convenience going on to make the novel fit narratively with the conventions of the genre. It's like you can't look too closely at society as a whole, because then the actual setting of the story will break down, if that makes sense. Also, sometimes the stereotyping of the characters, especially the Chinese characters, can feel a little bit culturally sensitive. I know that these books were written in the 90s and early noughties, and I'm in no way like the PC police at all. I just think some of the choices were very interesting. For example, there's a character called Lily Peng, and her character is supposed to represent sort of like the very conservative, always follow instructions, kind of never deviate from the party line Chinese person. And one of the ways in which the author emphasizes this about her is that he makes her pronunciation very Chinese. So, for example, one of the characters' names is Dr. Campbell, and the author writes as if Lily is saying her name, the two L's, as an R, so Campbell. So she can't really pronounce Campbell like most, Chinese people who don't speak that much English can't. But all the other Chinese characters don't really seem to have this same problem. They seem to be able to pronounce Campbell fine. They don't really have any problems pronouncing English. It's like not making fun of the way that she speaks, but sort of emphasizing this is supposed to emphasize how she is more Chinese in some way. Also, going back to the feng shui guy, again, the way that the dialogue is written is very peculiar to me. So, presumably this guy never speaks in English. He doesn't speak English. He always speaks in Chinese, but obviously the dialogue is written in English so that we can understand it. And the author has a way of writing this guy's speech so that it's like he's elongating his words. So, for example, he'll say something like, "Oh, the feng shui in this office is very bad." But you can't really speak like that in Chinese. I don't really know how to explain it. Like, there's no way that you can, like, elongate a character in a sentence to make it have that inflection that we know what he's trying to say. When certain people speak in English and they want to emphasize something, you have it drawn out just a little bit more. And there's not really a way to translate this into Chinese, but it's just interesting because you can't speak like that in Chinese and the character only speaks Chinese, but the writing is in English. It's just very, I don't know, the stereotyping in these situations, it doesn't really work for me. Like, it jarred a little bit, but it's not a huge problem. It doesn't come up a lot. It's just something, again, that probably stood out to me and most people would not even realize was happening or care about at all. Yeah. Okay, so I've hinted a little bit at the research aspects of the book already, but in general, I would say that the book is excellently researched. Everything from the police to how pathology works to Chinese culture, everything is very well done and presented in a way that's very believable. Obviously, I'm only an expert in one of these things, but I know that May got consultants for the medical and forensic aspects of his work, and it reads like it's true. Everything he writes about China at the time is correct to the best of my knowledge. I was never in Beijing in the 90s, but from what I know from 21st century Beijing, and also my study of the history of China, everything is very accurate and nothing stands out as being blatantly wrong. He even gives a sense of the geography and architecture, which is actually quite difficult to do, although I don't think it's always very necessary. Like the names of the streets that they drive down, for example, because I don't think anyone's going to go out of their way to cross-reference the book with a map of the city in the 90s, but, it's nice that he took his time to try and, put all the buildings accurately in their real geographical locations. There's also lots of small things, like the type of restaurants that the locals like to eat in, the relationship between urban people and rural people, the way Chinese people behave in things like queues. There's a lot of stuff that you can only get from personal experience and having lived in China or been to China quite a few times, and those really stand out as being excellent representations. But I do have one problem with the book. This is my only actual problem with the book, and it's going to be a problem that, again, no one else is going to have. So I don't care how progressive or open-minded the Chinese people that you meet are. No one in China has open conversations about events like the Cultural Revolution or Tiananmen Square with each other. They might do when they're talking to foreigners, often because foreigners are the only people that you can talk to about these things without it, being insensitive. But it's just not the case that people will casually bring up in conversation, oh yeah, I was on track for a good career, but then I was denounced by the Red Guards. It was a shame. Anyway, do you want to sing a tune that I composed on this piano before the Red Guards destroyed my old one? It's just, you can fight me on this if you want to, but I have actually studied this sort of phenomenon, especially surrounding the idea that young Chinese people do not know anything about certain major events because their elders are not willing to talk about it. Not to them, not to each other. People just don't talk about these things like an everyday conversation, which is the way it is presented in the book, on some occasions. And I don't want to harp on about this forever, but I actually had to teach a course on Chinese heritage that included a section on this once, so I just know that I'm not being over the top. For example, this is an excerpt from a study done in a Chinese village in 2006. Quote, "Those aged 25 to 35 only have a very vague idea of the local history of the last 50 years. Their knowledge of the past is extremely limited, and their understanding of Chinese history is equally incomplete. At school, their textbook only deals with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution in economic or factional terms, and in a very summary way. The repercussions on daily life are not addressed at any time. Furthermore, intergenerational transmission in this area does not seem to be very effective. Parents do not want to tackle certain episodes in their life, such as the 3 years of natural disaster, the Cultural Revolution, or their being sent to the countryside. Often they say it's in the past. In short, there's no point in talking about it. They also believe that their past does not interest their children, that they could not believe their story. Moreover, when parents refer to their painful past, they do so for educational purposes. If they blame their children for wasting things, they'll remind them about how difficult life used to be. Only a few inhabitants belonging to the younger generation have some knowledge of these periods. Grandparents seem then to have played an important role in transmission. The best time to listen to these stories of older generations was in the evening, in summer, when residents took out their chairs to cool off outside. This practice is still frequent in the old centre, although more and more dwellings are equipped with air conditioning, and the inhabitants prefer to stay in their apartments." So, while this study does acknowledge that those in the generation aged 35 to 65 are a bit more open about the personal aspects of the Cultural Revolution when prompted, it's clear that this isn't something that comes up spontaneously in day-to-day conversation, and even when it does, the general events are discussed in official terms. For example, the Great Leap Forward is described as the 3 years of natural disaster, which are exacerbated by relations with the Soviet Union. The main reason that people will bring it up is because they're directly questioned about how the events affected their lives in the long run and how it's impacted their ability to make a living. Many people talk about it with embarrassment, especially if they were part of the Red Guards, and many people leave a lot unspoken because it was traumatic. So yeah, I just wanted to focus on the fact that people are not just having casual conversations about the Cultural Revolution like it seems like they are in the book. I know that the main reason that the stuff is included in the book is so that the reader can have more context, and so that some of the characters are a bit more fleshed out. I don't know if May himself actually thinks that this is normal conversation for Chinese people, or if he just wrote it that way for the reader's benefit, but yeah, just clarifying that. Anyway, rant over. That was really my one major problem with the book, and that is, again, totally subjective, at least in my opinion. Other than that, the book is largely accurate, and to be fair, in the conversations that we see between different people, everything that they say is true, and could be a true story that happened to someone. It's not that he's making it up or exaggerating, it's just the way that the information is presented is not realistic. Okay, so, on to my final thoughts about the book. Just looking back through the script, I've realised that May wrote all 6 of these books in 5 years, which is really impressive, but also explains some of the personal issues that I have with the book. Generally speaking, I would say the majority of books that I read took 5 years to write. So writing 6 books within that same period of time means that a lot of things were probably left unchanged or only partially edited, because the audience for this kind of book prefers more faster as opposed to having to wait a long time for the next installment. I think that's fair enough, but it means that some of the awkward phrasing or superfluous descriptions get left in. Honestly, it felt sometimes as if I edit the scripts for this podcast more than the book was edited, but then he also has more writing experience, and just because he wrote them quickly, it doesn't mean that the book isn't good. After all, Stephen King also writes notoriously fast and is also immensely popular. I think it's just worth bearing in mind that I personally think that the speed is reflected in the writing and the style. Something that this book made me think about a lot was the fact that I haven't been on holiday this year. Holidays, sitting by the pool or the beach, that's where I do the majority of my fiction reading, especially genre fiction. I read next to no genre fiction outside of my holiday time, so sometimes I feel like this held me back in the process because it made it more laborious somehow. Like, I kept starting and stopping reading it. Well, I only had one long sit-down session where I got through the majority of the book, but it's because I had found time to just sit in my house and read it. But I also was thinking and doing other things like laundry and cooking and stuff, so I didn't really have the detachment or the relaxation necessary, I think, to really get a deep dive into the characters and the world building and stuff. So would I read the other books in this series? Yes, I would, but on holiday. It's probably a personal thing, but I find that I need to be like fully relaxed, have a long period of time where I can just sit down and shut everything out and just like get really into the story. And would I recommend the book to you guys? Yes, I would. I think especially if you're wanting to know more about Chinese culture, history, architecture, if you want to know more about what Chinese society was like in the 90s, I think this book is really interesting. Also, how the Chinese police force works. No one really knows that kind of stuff, even today. At least not from like a casual sort of day-to-day how it works perspective. So there's lots of interesting insights. You guys are already interested in China, which is why you're listening to this podcast. I think if you like crime, thriller, genre fiction, and you want to know more about Chinese culture and society in the 90s, I would give it a read. Okay, so that's it for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to hear from me more often, you can go to the sinobabble.com website and sign up for my email list to get updates about the podcast, my newsletter, and other stuff that I think is important. For example, I've recently been appearing on other people's podcasts, talking about everything from Chinese history and culture to modern comparative politics, which has been both interesting and quite challenging. I will keep you updated about future appearances and much more if you sign up for the email list, again by going to sinobabble.com. I also release a Substack every other Wednesday, so the Wednesday where there is no podcast. I talk about modern Chinese politics or current affairs, and then I kind of take that story and place it in its historical and cultural context. The most recent newsletter is about the case of Xinjiang Cotton, H&M, and state-sanctioned Twitter memes. Finally, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can make a donation to the podcast by going to the sinobabble.com website and clicking on the donate button. You can make a one-off or monthly donation, but anything that you choose to give is greatly appreciated. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you tune in next time.